Because what we're trying to get an understanding of here today is as big a move, as big a step as the Jamaica Debt Exchange was, we want to get an understanding of how significant it is going to be in terms of what it achieves, and if there is anything else that needs to be done going forward. So let's first start by putting it in the context of the situation we're in Jamaica, land we love. We have been struggling with this massive amount of debt for the last dozen or so years. A debt which essentially we accumulated between 1996, when the debt to GDP ratio was 69%, and 2003, when the debt to GDP ratio peaked at 123%. These numbers, by the way, may seem calibrated slightly differently from the ones you're accustomed to hearing, because they reflect the revision of the system of national accounts by Statin about a year ago. And it inflated the overall GDP numbers by about 15% or so. So these debt to GDP numbers may seem slightly lower than you're accustomed to, but we've applied them consistently through all the years. Since we hit the peak in 2003, the debt has been up and down after that. Well, more down and then up, because the debt to GDP ratio actually went on a downward trend for 4 years. And that seemed to have been going fine, illusory to some extent, and we'll explain why later on. But then last year, the debt ballooned by a rather impressive 10 or so percentage points of GDP. And managing this high debt has required debt servicing, a burdensome debt servicing that has been taking, on average, about half of tax revenue to service. And again, that half, you need to sort of know when things are bad and not so bad, because last year, the servicing of debt went from 43% of tax revenue to 66% of tax revenue. This enormous burden of servicing the debt is what has created a situation over all of these years where the fiscal accounts, and therefore the country, always seem to be on the cusp of crisis. And even then, slipping over once every 2 or 3 years into an actual crisis. This always flirting at the edge of vulnerability. And of course, last year, when the rise in debt servicing actually tipped us over into a crisis, that was what ushered in a series of measures that the government has enacted that we are trying to understand here the significance of. The first one, of course, was the re-engagement with the IMF. After 14 or so years of having no dealings with them, then in December, the government introduced a $21 billion tax package. And most significant of all was the Jamaica Debt Exchange. So we're trying to see if we can understand the context of this and how it is going to change our debt dynamics and fiscal situation going forward. The problem with managing this enormous debt burden is that it draws resources away from the other, more valuable ways that government is supposed to spend public money. It draws resources away principally from capital expenditure, from investments in roads and bridges and airport expansions that become the basis of economic growth.